Okay, welcome everybody to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. Really excited to be here today to discuss our paper, but let me tell you a little bit about who we are, just in case this is new to you. My name is Cassy Dorff. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. I run the Online Peace Science Colloquium with my co-director, Brad Smith, who is also an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and our amazing graduate assistant, Jennifer Barnes. This started off in 2015. We are a part of the Peace Science Society, and we really had the goal to bring and celebrate excellent research that happens both before and after our Peace Science Society meetings. So trying to share our research to a wider community online and provide this as a helpful workshop and discussion style space for different folks to present their work. Today, we have a paper entitled The Effects of Exposure to Violence on Social Network Composition and Formation, Evidence from IDP Camps in Myanmar by Daniel Thomas from Columbia University. He's a PhD candidate there. And we have three awesome discussants. We bring you Jennifer Larson from Vanderbilt University, Zoe Marks from Harvard University, and Michael Rubin from the University of Connecticut. The structure for today is that we will have our presenter, Daniel Thomas, present for about 15 minutes. And then we'll turn it over to the discussants. They'll each give us some comments and we'll try to get a conversation going. If you're in the audience and you're watching this now versus later, the recorded version, you can chime in using the Q&A, leave some comments, leave some questions. I'll do my best as your moderator today to bring those into the discussion. And have no fear, if they don't make it into the discussion, I am going to put them together for Daniel so that he can get those comments later. And with that, I think I have covered it all. And so Daniel, let's turn it over to you.
Great, let me share my screen. Can you guys see that okay?
Looks great.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Cassy, for organizing this. And thanks for all the discussants and Jennifer for putting this together as well. I'm going to share a paper today that's based on field work that I conducted in Myanmar in 2018 and 2019, with the data collection taking place in 2019. And the idea behind the paper is trying to understand the effects that exposure to violence during the displacement process has on subsequent network formation within IDP camps. So the question and the motivating idea here is, how does violence shape social networks? So we know a lot about why social networks matter for people in developing contexts and all sorts of contexts, but we don't know a lot about how it forms for people, especially those in the situations where networks might matter the most. But we do know that displacement changes the composition of individual social networks. That's a result of basically being forced from your home into a new location. And here I'm going to ask how variation in exposure to violence affects how social networks are formed and maintained. And specifically, I'm going to focus on a tension between trauma affecting the ability of people to form new social ties, and also differentials in the value of social network ties for the displaced. So to study these questions, I used social network data that was collected from 5 camps for the internally displaced in Kachin State, Myanmar in 2019. And I'll give you the context from that location a little bit. But just as a preview to the findings, what I show is that those who are exposed to violence have smaller networks of pre-displacement ties in the IDP camps and smaller networks of close ties within the IDP camps, but tend to have similar sized networks of new ties within the camps. However, then I also show that these new ties that are formed become close ties at a lower rate if in the dyad of these ties, at least one of the IDPs has been exposed to violence. And what this kind of evidence is for is that exposure to violence decreases integration within camps, even in a hard case. So this is a case where they've been in the camps for a long time. These are so close-knit social environments, and yet I still show that IDPs who are exposed to violence have smaller social networks post-treatment. So as a little bit idea of why this matters, there's a lot of literature for why networks are important. Here I focus on why networks are important for specifically post-conflict recovery. So there's evidence that social networks matter for information and financial security. So for people to get access to jobs, especially when their livelihoods have been disrupted, social networks are a key source of providing that information. They serve as informal sources of insurance against shocks. So in places where Insurance mechanisms are not highly institutionalized. Social networks can kind of fill the gap. They facilitate informal favor exchange, and they also give access to employment. And so the ability of IDPs to form new networks is going to be probably a key aspect in their ability to recover from conflict, especially in situations like that of Myanmar, where things are not institutionalized and these IDPs don't have access to a lot of aid. And this goes along with evidence that I show in the survey. So this is just descriptive evidence of the value of social networks for the IDPs that I study here. So on the left, these are just counts of binary variables measuring the belief of IDPs in different aspects of the importance of social networks. So for the large majority of IDPs within these camps, they borrow from the community in times of need. They believe that the ability to share with their neighbors is something that can increase their security. They believe that community building increases their ability to cope with disaster and bad events. And if given a choice between insurance for themselves or partial insurance for the entire IDP camps, they would almost always prefer protection for all the IDPs within the camps. So this is just anecdotal, but it is evidence for the fact that these IDPs really care about their community building. On the right-hand side, I show that in the closest ties network, so in a network of ties of people that you communicate most with in the camps, having more ties or higher degree in these networks decreases people's fear of walking at night, so they feel more secure in their locations, and also increases their belief that they can borrow from the community if needed. So this is just descriptive evidence showing that these networks matter for the outcomes that we think they should matter for in these sorts of locations. And so the question then turns to who is forming these social networks, who has high degree in these networks, and who is lagging behind. So I focus on basically two different types of effects of violence in these networks. The first is the effect on initial ties, which is I think an easier part of the theory to understand, in that exposure to violence affects and decreases the initial ties that an IDP has in the camp. And this is because violence simply disrupts networks through death and separation. So when you experience violence in your village or city before you are displaced, you should be less likely to have as many pre-displacement ties in the place where you arrive to. And this is because people are removed from that network. They may, households that directly experience violence might lose family members, lose household members, and they also might be more likely to be separated during the displacement process and end up in different camps. So an observable implication for this direct effect is that treated IDPs, those who are exposed to violence, should have less ties and networks composed of ties from their pre-displacement village. That's the first thing I'll look at. The second effect I'm going to look at is how violence affects new ties of IDPs. And there's a few different reasons to think that violence should have an effect here, but the ultimate effect of it is a little bit ambiguous, and I'll explain why. So the first reason is that exposure to violence causes trauma. This is a well-established finding, especially among communities of the internally displaced, that those who experience more intense violence during the displacement process tend to have more trauma, more PTSD, and more anxiety within the camps after they're displaced. And this should make forming ties more difficult. Trauma can make social integration more difficult, and this has been shown in a few different studies among the displaced. So on the one hand, you would expect those who are exposed to violence to have more difficulty being able to integrate socially. On the other hand, exposure to violence can also increase the value of forming new ties for IDPs. And this is because exposure to violence can increase perceptions of vulnerability to future shocks. And so when you've been exposed to violence, you think you're uniquely more vulnerable to be exposed to it again in the future. And in a less institutionalized setting like this, where there aren't a lot of formal forms of insurance or aid, social networks fill that gap. And so these IDPs might be incentivized to form new ties in order to have greater sources of insurance in the future. Finally, there's another mechanism, which is that if IDPs have less initial ties, less pre-displacement ties, this might make tie formation more difficult if your ability to form a new tie is a function of initial degree. In the setting that I study here, I think that maybe this isn't as large of a mechanism because these are smaller camps and they've been there for a long time, but this is still a theoretical mechanism that might explain the link between experience and violence and their social network formation. So what the observable implications for these, for trauma, we would expect a lower number of new ties and close ties in the network and a lower overlap of ties between new ties and close ties. And this is because even if they're forming new ties, they might be less strong ties because they're not able to integrate as successfully. And second, we would expect a form of treatment in the form of witnessing violence and not necessarily your family member or you directly experiencing it to increase trauma and then decrease the number of new ties and close ties you have. Conversely, if the value in ties mechanism is what we observe, we would see a greater number of new ties among the exposed IDPs and also a greater overlap between new ties and close ties as these close ties fill the gap for the lack of initial ties of these IDPs. And the third, if the lack of initial ties is what's causing the effect that we show between violence and social network formation, we would expect a lower number of new ties and close ties. And we would expect this effect to be operating by the family or the respondent directly experiencing violence and thus having smaller networks of initial ties. So these are the implications that I'm going to try to explore empirically with this data. So I study this question in Kachin State, Myanmar, which is the most northernmost state within Myanmar. It borders China and India. This is not the Rohingya conflict. This is a different ethnic group called the Kachin, but they've been in conflict with the state of Myanmar since about 1961. There was a ceasefire from the early 90s to 2011 that then ended and the conflict reignited. And since then, there's been more than 100,000 displaced individuals in the state. And there, the Myanmar military, the Tatmadaw, uses large-scale airstrikes and artillery strikes against different locations, which then lead to the flight of villagers. So on the right here is a map showing the different camps that the IDPs came from, and then also where the city in which the IDP camps surround that I was able to survey is. In terms of how displacement works in Kachin State, it generally occurs due to military operations near villages, not necessarily village clearance operations. So the operations tend to not be targeted all the time at the civilians themselves and not targeted at necessarily destroying the villages, but civilians are all often caught in the crossfires here. And I'm going to rely on the randomness of this violence within villages as a sort of source of identification in the empirical strategy. Villagers tend to flee to camps there, and most of them remained housed there. In my sample, the average IDP has been in their camp for 6 years now. And at this point, there's no prospect of returning, as even though the conflict has calmed down in the last year or so, there still really isn't a lot of progress on a peace deal. So I collected data from 647 households in 5 IDP camps near the city of Maijayang. And within the camps, we tried to sample every household in order to construct a complete social network. To ensure enumerator and respondent safety, we did all the surveys in the non-government controlled area. So in the area that's controlled by the Kachin Independence Organization, such that respondents would feel comfortable talking about their experiences of violence with the state. And the networks that I construct here, I basically constructed using FastLink to match the records because I use a name generator approach as camp level censuses were not available. So we asked each respondents basically to name for each of the different networks up to 5 names of people who they have ties with. And the networks are directed in that I can have a tie with one person who does not necessarily have a tie with me. And they're closed in that I only consider networks here of people who were surveyed within the camps. And the bottom here shows some summary statistics of what the different networks look like. On the right is an example network. So this is the close ties network for the first camp that we implemented the survey in. So what I'm going to focus on is the relationship between edges in the different networks and exposure to violence. And here just shows some balance on it. I'm going to move quickly now because I think I'm actually running out of time. So the first empirical strategy that I use is dyadic regression. So the question is, does the experience of violence affect the probability that an edge exists between respondents I and J? So this just takes it's a binary variable. That's 1 if the edge exists, 0 otherwise. And I estimate the effective levels of exposure to violence within a dyad. So it's 0 if neither respondent was exposed to violence, 1 if only one was, and 2 if both were exposed. Within these regressions, I include camp fixed effects and the levels of unbalanced covariates between the different dyads. And then here I correct the standard errors for dyadic dependence. So the results here show that exposure to violence has a negative effect on the probability of a pre-displacement tie and a closest tie existing within dyads. And this is a pretty large magnitude. So in the pre-displacement network, for each treated respondent, there's a 32% decrease in the probability that an edge exists for every, and in the close ties, it's a decrease of 21.8% from the baseline. However, we do see a null result on the probability of edges in the network of new ties, indicating that IDPs are forming new ties at similar rates. I then also conduct the analysis at the individual level using pre-displacement village fixed effects for identification and also controlling for unbalanced covariates. So the idea here is we're comparing villagers from the same pre-displacement village who were exposed to violence or not, and seeing how that affects basically their degree within the networks within the camps. And here we see similar results in the dyadic approach. There's a negative effect of violence on pre-displacement and close ties, but it's still a null effect on new ties. So to understand what's driving basically these results, I then look at the overlap in the networks between the new ties and the close ties. So what I show here is that edges in new ties network with the member of the dyad who has been exposed to violence are less likely to overlap with the close ties network. And this suggests that while forming ties at similar rates, those exposed to violence are less able to convert them into strong ties. So if a new tie has a treated member within it, it's less likely to become a close tie within the close tie network. And so what this might indicate is that exposed people are still not able to form new ties strongly at a consistent rate, and that the null effect that we see in the new ties network might be that we're asking about a really specific form of tie that might not actually be a really salient one. So when I ask people, tell me 5 people that you formed these ties within the camps, they just give me names that maybe don't mean that much because they kind of feel forced to give up to 5 names. That might be the effect that's operating here. But what this does show is that these new ties might not be becoming strong ties overall. Then I disaggregate the binary treatment variable into measures of either your family experiencing, witnessing, or you personally experiencing violence. And what I show here is that while family experiencing violence has a negative effect on pre-displacement ties, it's really witnessing violence that has the effect on the close ties. And this is some evidence that those who have experienced, have a greater trauma due to the violence might be lagging behind in their ability to form the close ties. And perhaps it's not the initial ties that are causing the lack of close ties later on. Just for time's sake here, I'm gonna wrap up. So the implications, the key result here is that those who experience violence have less initial ties and close ties, but similar amount of new ties. And we're seeing this effect in the long term. The average respondent's been in the camp for 6 years and they still lag behind in the close ties network. This suggests that IDPs who are exposed to violence might be less able to form strong networks than those who are not exposed. On the one hand, these results are somewhat good news for post-conflict recovery. So there's little evidence of an effect of violence on new tie formation. But at the same time, if these ties are not becoming strong at the same rate, we might expect them to not have the same strong networks, which might be the key networks for their ability to recover. In terms of generalizing these results, it's important to note that these camps are tight-knit, they're long-term, and they're homogeneous among religion and ethnicity. But this is also a hard case then, because then forming ties might be easier in this sort of environment. And we might see greater effects of exposure to violence in a less homogeneous and a less centralized environments, for instance, in places where IDPs move to cities instead of camps. I'm gonna wrap up there, and I look forward to the comments.
Great, thanks so much, Daniel. I think we had Michael going first for comments.
Awesome. Well, first, Daniel, thanks for this really interesting paper. I learned a lot from it, so that's already your main goal is satisfied. So I think we'll have a lot of interesting discussion about what we can hopefully offer as points to get you to publication. So here we go. So the first set of things that I want to discuss, and I have more detailed comments written out that I'll send you afterwards, is one set of questions I had was about helping us to understand the context a little better. And I think that's important because what I was trying to piece together is about like, who are these people that end up in the camps? Not just like the things that we've learned about them from your description, but also I would imagine there are other possibilities of people either fleeing to other parts of the country, either they seek refuge with family members in other parts that weren't exposed to violence, or they might go across the border to China, India, or elsewhere. I don't know if that's true or not. And what are the proportion and what are the different like makeup of the people that end up in IDP camps versus these other places, so that we can think about, okay, what is the treatment effect that we're getting at, and how might we think about comparing them if we're interested in the overall effect of violence on, you know, social network formation, as opposed to just within these specific IDP camps, right? And another thing that I was wondering throughout, which is more minor, is you kept referencing these non-government controlled areas, and I wasn't sure exactly what that meant. Is it that the rebel groups control these areas? Is it that they're just outside of the area of control of any of these armed actors? Are they actually under state surveillance or not? Because that might affect how they think about their vulnerabilities and such, like you said. The other set of questions I had were about understanding the treatment or the explanatory variable, which builds off what I was just talking about, which is sort of, I would imagine that an additional sort of endogeneity concern that you would want to get at. You talked a lot about how the effect or how the military strategic decision-making sort of makes it quasi-random, exogenous. But I would also think that the pre-existing social network structure and social cohesion in these networks would affect like whether or not people escaped and to where, right? So if you have a tightly cohesive network with a lot of strong social connections, those might be the people that get the information that the military is coming or violence is about to be visited upon here, and they might transplant themselves in the camps or in other places in a situation where they have the stronger and larger social network ties that then, you know, the correlation with violence could be the reverse. I don't mean to suggest that the effects that you're finding are, you know, can be or are possibly entirely explained by that, but you want to at least engage with that possibility that the pre-existing social networks could affect the distribution of violence exposure versus non-violent violence exposure in the camps later. Right, and so the other set of comments I had was about the parts of the empirical strategy. So one, I was actually not sure why the dyadic regression, because I thought, and others who are more expert in the theoretical and empirical frameworks going on with the networks might help a bit here. But I was thinking that your theory and where I was led on the theoretical framework and literature review was all about these individual level effects. And I wasn't sure how or why there was a implication for the dyadic relationships, like why certain pairs would, I can imagine a scenario in which that follows directly, but I'm not sure about like how the aggregating of effects directly maps onto the dyadic relationship. And it seemed like you had all that you needed with the individual. So I could be wrong there, but maybe at least a little framing of why that is tied to the theory. For the mechanisms that you tested, the first one about, what is this? Oh yeah, so I was wondering does the finding that violence exposed IDPs' new ties are less likely to become close ties actually necessarily imply that the violence exposed are less able to form strong ties because of trauma? So you phrase it as like as a test of the mechanism between the trauma and the value of ties, but they don't necessarily seem directly contradictory in a way that would be like a direct test. Not that you couldn't directly test that, but they seem that they wouldn't necessarily have opposite implications on that test. And I was also thinking that finding could be consistent with these people, as you showed in the previous regression, have fewer pre-displacement ties, right? And so I would imagine it's easier to form close ties with friends of friends. And so it could just be that is explaining why the people who are violence exposed have not only fewer pre-displacement ties, but that fewer of those new ties are becoming close. So just to float that out there. And then on the mechanisms for the difference in the effect, one of the disaggregating the treatment effect, when I was wondering, are those different effects, you showed that they're different magnitudes of size, but are they statistically different from each other? In the sense you were making a claim about, it goes through this treatment, but not this other or less so this other treatment. But I'm wondering if they're actually statistically different from each other. Is it the case, there might be literature on this and I may have missed it in the paper, but is it the case that having a family member exposed to violence, even if you didn't witness it, is necessarily more traumatic than witnessing somebody who you don't know be exposed to violence, right? I was thinking, like, if you have to live with somebody who experienced violence and suffer with them along with their suffering, it wasn't like so clear cut to me that it would be, that the trauma differential would go in that direction that was sort of being argued or assumed. But I don't know. You have a better sense of the literature. And if it is that way, then maybe there's just some citation or something that you can put in there to deal with that. I think I missed a few things, but I'll turn over the floor, and I have it all written up anyway, so I can send it to you, all the notes that I took.
Thank you, Mike. That's awesome.
All right, thanks. My turn next, right? Cool. Well, Daniel, I think this project is really exciting, and I'm definitely sold on its importance. And I especially like the framing that, of course, social networks are really important to people and can serve as valuable sources of access to resources and protection. And also, when we're thinking about post-violent settings, post-conflict settings, we're especially interested in integration. And by measuring how people create their social ties, this is a much more direct measure of integration than typical indirect measures or single aspects of integration in other projects. So, like, I'm sold, I think it's important, and I think it's a really exciting project. So I just wanted to raise sort of 3 classes of things, like think about, see if you could push on them a little bit more in the project. The first builds on something Michael was talking about as well, which is that I wonder if it would be possible to dig a little bit deeper into this finding about the pre-existing ties. And especially I'm intrigued by whether or not the finding that people who are exposed to violence have a smaller pre-displacement network. I want to know whether or not that's really driven by the selection into a camp and the fact that you're asking whether or not they have ties to others in this particular camp that they had in their life before they got here, or whether it really is a matter of the fact that violence ruins networks even if they had stayed put. It's like, did violence take people out of their network, or did violence send them somewhere, leaving their ties behind and dispersing them in a way that scattered them? Both are important, and whether, if at least one of them is true, that's important. But I'm intrigued and would love to know if you could say anything more about the difference between them. And it seems like there might be leverage to get at that by thinking about how many people from their village showed up in the camp. Like, you talk about including village fixed effects, but I wonder if the size of the option set could be leveraged in some way here to get at the difference. The second class of things that I wanted to push on was also something Michael raised about the dyadic regression. I guess I'm predisposed to be interested in knowing where dyads come from, so I had no problem seeing dyadic regressions, and I'm intrigued by where ties come from. And I wonder if you could get more out of this so right now, beta in this regression is constrained to tell us equally much about the difference between the presence of ties between people with in which neither experience violence and one experience violence, and if one in the pair or both experience violence. Like that's constrained to be the same by setting up the regression like this. And I wonder if you could tell us something more by separately running a regression where you first include an indicator for whether or not at least anyone in the pair experienced violence, and just compare no one had experienced violence to at least someone experienced violence, and separately contrast one person experienced violence versus both. Idea being maybe there's something different and maybe even facilitating ties if you have experienced violence personally and encounter someone else. Maybe this is sort of like a moment to bond, something you could get into together, and it would be easier to form that kind. So I just wonder if there's a difference there that you could exploit and tell us more about. And the third thing I wanted to push on was this idea of close ties, because it's especially intriguing that there appears to be a difference between the propensity to convert ties into close ones between people who've experienced violence and people who haven't. And so two things in this realm. First, a lot of the setup in the paper tells us why ties in general are important, and even gives us survey evidence that people in these camps understand that ties are valuable to them. And that's great, but it doesn't do as much work to tell us why close ties would be qualitatively even more important and more impactful. So to make more of this finding, I think setting up why close ties are really better than not close ties would be important groundwork to lay. And the second thing is, if I understood correctly, the way close ties are measured here is with the name generator that asks people, who do you communicate with frequently, as opposed to the other name generator that measures just regular old ties, which just asks, who do you communicate with in general, give me up to 5 of them. And so again, if I gleaned correctly where the measure of closeness comes from, it is the close ties here are those ties that a respondent says they communicate with very frequently or very much or most, communicate with most in the camp. And so that is a measure of something about closeness, but surely doesn't capture the full realm of things we might mean by strong ties. And so I wonder if you could make more or convey more what exactly the aspect of closeness you measure, and tell us why that in particular is the thing that matters. Like, why does it matter that these people don't have as many people they report as communicating with very much? They just have people they communicate with. Like, what does that specific difference that you're measuring really tell us about closeness, and how does it relate to which kinds of closeness are most important? So those are the 3 big things I wanted to raise for now. Look forward to chatting more, but I'll turn it over to Zoe.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jen. Cassy, can you start waving at me if I hit 5 minutes and look like I don't know, because I will otherwise probably run on.
Got it.
Thank you. Daniel, this is a really interesting and exciting project, and I was so excited to see that somebody else is looking at how to quantify integration in conflict zones and how to think about the relationship between violence and trauma. So I've got some of my work that is work in progress I'd love to send you. But of course, focusing today on what you're trying to achieve here, I think Jen covered a lot of the things that I was going to mention. So I'll just echo those points as I come across them in my notes, and I'll send you my detailed comments after our conversation. But maybe the thing that hasn't been discussed yet that I'd like you to think about the most is really trying to work on what your theory of violence is. I think violence kind of is cleansed, if you will, and neutralized and turned into a treatment effect so that you can communicate to political science culture of RCTs. And I think that you do a disservice to the people you're studying, and also to your own insights into the relational and psychological impact violence has on people's life trajectories. And you also have this sort of cross-temporal ethos in your work that's maybe not quite captured in the data, which I'll come to in a second, but that should be kind of captured in how you're theorizing violence. And so a couple of things that come to mind that are not really even introduced into the conversation until that very last section of the paper is one about, does it matter the intensity of violence vis-a-vis the nature of a harm that's experienced? I mean, often we sort of overlook the selection effect of people being killed, excluded from the data set, but I could imagine the social impact of losing family members could really dramatically shape where you choose to relocate to. I couldn't tell if violence is additive. So the more people in your household or in your immediate community who've experienced some form of physical violence, does that matter? And I also wasn't sure if the recency or the kind of time lag since the violence exposure and the networks that you're measuring matters. And so I think I'm not at all bothered by using, cross-sectional observational data. That is not the hat I wear in this profession. But I would like for you to kind of tell us a little bit more about how you understand violence to affect people, and particularly how it might affect people in a way that's kind of intelligible at the high level where you're trying to capture these patterns. I also think you've got a real opportunity to do a little bit more theoretical work. And I just mean like soft descriptive work. I don't mean advanced kind of theory building around displacement, because it's not entirely clear to me whether you're engaging with the literature that sees displacement as itself an experience of violence, or displacement as this sort of time interruption that leads people into a camp. And so that would be, I think, helpful for me in just sort of disentangling some of the things that you've set up as independent variables that are also a little bit outside the way that the paper invests its time right now. I would also, this is maybe just me, but I would really reconsider the phrasing of pre-displacement ties, because I went well into the paper before I realized that it wasn't a retrospective question. You didn't ask people, who did you used to be friends with, who you're still friends with here? You said, who from your village are you friends with here? And if I was displaced to, wherever that none of you lived, I would, make new friends, but maybe some of those people would be from Cambridge, and it was our Cambridge connection that made us bond. So I was a little bit skeptical of this idea that calling them pre-displacement is the most efficient way for us to understand what you're talking about. I'm also interested in hearing more from you about this idea of capturing the exposure to violence in a extensively exposed society. This is a problem I've dealt with in my research in DRC and in Northeast Nigeria, where the exposure to violence levels are so high that it's almost it feels like it's artificially distinguishing between degrees or valences of victimization. And so I just thought maybe that's an opportunity for you to make a contribution in this paper. I wasn't sure if the KIA commits violence. You seem to just be bracketing that entirely, and maybe they have really good kind of restraint around their own community. But I thought that was interesting in terms of what is this case and how might we understand this case compared to other contexts. And I also wasn't sure if criminal, domestic, and intimate partner violence or community violence might be picked up in your survey, and if so, how you're dealing with that, particularly because you bring in some of that literature. And I assume usually people in IDP camps have pretty high levels of vulnerability and exposure to other forms of violence that aren't necessarily from the state. Like Jen, I really wanted to know more about close ties. I think I was importing and trying to project my strong tie theory from social network research. And I was like, so kin and childhood friends, what is this? And throughout, I don't think you ever define it. So please define it immediately so that we just can get into your framework of it. But also think about maybe having conversations with your research assistants or asking them to do maybe a focus group with your enumerators so that we can get a qualitative sense of what frequency looks like. Are these people they're communicating with because of social proximity, because they can call them for free with the phone networks, or because they genuinely are the people that they most want to talk to because they depend on them. Let's see. I also, there's always this semantic stuff that I pick up on because I think it's so important, but maybe in the writing process it's hard to identify. You seem to talk about people not having as close of ties, or that people who've experienced trauma are not going to have as close of ties. And I don't think the size of ties or the likelihood of having a close tie is a good way to capture whether or not that tie is strong, right? If that makes sense. So to some extent, some of your writings seem to slip into assessing the closeness of a relationship when you really just mean the likelihood of observing a frequent communication between two people. And I think that's really important when you're making the sort of leap to well-being and social support for people who've experienced trauma or violence. Last 2 points, I'll try to make them relatively quickly. One, you're kind of eliding trauma and violence, and I wonder if they might be meaningfully distinct. And maybe this is something we can kind of have a follow-up conversation about, but I'm not sure you can infer trauma from violence. And I also wanted to hear more about your case selection and the scope conditions. I think that's really important with this case, that we sort of understand, is this a case of everything that's happening in Myanmar? Is this a case of certain types of conflicts that are ubiquitous or maybe overlooked? And then lastly, the network boundary. You've got like a multi-level analysis here, and I'm sort of biased towards EgoNets because I think that you can survey an EgoNet and kind of trust it. And I think the network modeling is really popular and important, but I kind of expected to see the individual level data before the full network data so that we could understand kind of the limitations of the data and understand a little bit more about the relationships that people were bringing to the table. And then also the full network is where you lose a bunch of observations. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. These are great comments. Good job, team. For those in our audience, if you do want to leave a comment, hit me up in the Q&A and I'll work it in or leave it for Daniel. Daniel, what would you like to keep discussing and respond to with those?
Okay, so I'm gonna
I
go.
think you got enough.
I'm gonna go backwards to, I'm gonna start with Zoe's and kind of pick and choose, I think, from the things that I'd like to discuss a little bit more. And
yeah.
Jen and then Mike, if that works out, okay?
Yeah, don't feel like you have to respond to all of them. This is for you to get us to give you feedback and stuff like that, so.
Yeah. So Zoe, I really appreciate the comments on theorizing about violence here. I think that a difficulty for me is building a strong theory here and then also trying to like reach the the identification causal inference limitations of trying to work with a binary variable. So what I didn't want to do is overstate basically what I'm able to capture the effect of here, because I think that would be like a disservice to the paper and also to a lot of people who work on this in a complex way. So I'm wondering what you think like the correct framing would be in terms of thinking about violence here. So in terms of like what my own beliefs and priors are here, I see that everybody in my sample was exposed to violence in some way. They were forced from their homes. They've been living in an IDP camp for 6 years. And so what I'm trying to capture with these measures basically is variation in the intensity of the violence. And so what I think would be good to kind of follow up on is to understand, like, from what you've seen in this paper, what you think that I'm able to speak to here in terms of like the complexities of violence and theorizing about that, and how to not overstep the bounds of what my data can say when trying to talk about that. Because this is, I mean, it's obviously a part of the literature that some people are very protective of some parts of. So when writing this paper, you don't want to like overstep parts of it. I also want to talk about closeness, and this is what Jen talked about as well. So I guess the question that I have about this is that, so when eliciting these kind of names, you have to choose kind of a way to describe it to the respondent. I chose communication here because in terms of the theorization of what networks do, especially in developing context, the ability to share information seems to be like a key mechanism that people focus on. Instead of calling these close ties, should I just focus on like high communication ties, like relabel them? Or is this something where I should talk about why why communication is close? I think that's what Jen was alluding to, is that talk about basically the key role of information here, and then say, because of that, I feel justified in calling these close ties, close meaning that they share information. Is that like an acceptable framing? Is something I think that I'd like a little bit of feedback on. And I appreciate the rest of your comments. I'll try to. I'm gonna move on to Jen now, just so I don't get too bogged down with all of it.
If you don't mind me jumping in, let's go ahead and try to talk about those, just to get that feedback, so that we don't run out of time with that. So the first one, what can you really say about violence? And you're acknowledging that everyone's experiencing it, but how do you kind of frame that? Did anyone want to jump in on that, and then we can talk about the closeness concept? Yeah, Zoe?
Maybe I can just share like a couple of initial thoughts. And this is hard. Like I have been doing this research my whole career, and I don't think I ever have like executed or implemented the advice I give to others, because you can see it for other people better than you can see it when you're like trying to execute anything in the field. But one thing that comes to mind, if you have the data, would be to actually like think about it newly as a social violence, like the violence to the family. How many people were in the family or in the household in the village before they relocated, and how many are in the camp? And like, if you have that data, that could be a kind of very rough indicator of what the social dislocation was that happened during displacement. And you might be able to kind of correspond that with the, or even interact. I don't know exactly what the right technique would be, but, you know, connect that to the violence they describe. And so I sometimes think like novel measures where it's not so much the harms that like Human Rights Watch reports, but it's rather the harms that your theory is interested in. That could be one way of getting at it. Another thing, of course, is just to check for whether there's an additive or aggregative effect. And if there's not, I think that to me would be a point sort of towards being a little bit wary of assuming that there are certain, that exposure to violence directly corresponds to trauma, because you kind of make this artful link with witnessing. But as Jen said, we don't know if that's witnessing. I think it was Jen, maybe Michael, witnessing your family member or witnessing a stranger. And then in the appendix, you show that personal experiences of violence actually don't have the same patterns. And so that's like, you know, maybe some of the post-traumatic growth research and other theories of trauma, you know, you've got lots of different kinds of trauma that people are experiencing. And so just calling it trauma or violence exposure or even worse treatment, I think does away with some of the more granular data that you have, where you could even just say illustratively, I've looked into this and surprisingly, these don't all co-vary in the same way we might expect, and aggregate or additive effects don't apply. And so from like anecdotally, I've had, you know, interviewees cry when describing losing a loved one, but not ever break down when describing things that happened to themselves. And I think that, you know, that's an emotional dynamic that you seem to think is perhaps shaping the way people are forming relationships in the camps. I'd love to hear what others think.
Yeah, does anyone else want to jump on that before we talk about the closeness stuff? Michael?
I read the paper to mean that you were talking mainly about sort of kinetic forms of violence, like closeness to my life might be ended here, as opposed to the structural forms of violence, like being displaced and losing property and other things. And maybe making that distinction and what those form, like that sort of kinetic or battlefield or state repression type of violence experience means, as opposed to these others that are going on at the same time, could be helpful. And then I think part of these questions that keep resurfacing could be addressed in the paper in the form of, describe, I guess I tried to articulate this earlier, but like describing what each of these forms of violence really means to the people that are experiencing them. So, and in comparison to the other people who are living through this conflict, right? So the people who are witnessing violence, does that mean that they were standing at their doorway and a artillery hit their neighbor's house and it could have just as easily hit theirs? Or does it mean that like someone in the street was like punished for doing something specifically that, you know, so like a selective form of violence versus indiscriminate violence? Like what is the fear that is being generated by witnessing the violence? You know what I mean? Like, am I experiencing it as that could have just as easily happened to me or not? Does that matter? I don't know. And again, like how Zoe's illustration really hit home the other point that I thought was important, which is it very well may be that the loss of life, even if you didn't witness it, of someone that's you're in your family or close to, could be equally as or more traumatic than, especially if it's you know, a more distanced witnessing of the violence, of the kinetic violence that happens. At least like delving into that possibility and engaging with the conditions under which these sort of assumptions about the mechanisms and the tests that you're performing, that could help framing it up front as what are the lived experiences of these different types of violence.
Yeah, Daniel, I think, I was just going to say, I think your paper's in a really nice spot because it's very clean and streamlined, and now you can add back in some of this context that people are asking for. I too had a hard a little bit of a hard time figuring out when thinking about violence, what's the unit we're talking about? Is it the individual? Is it family? And is it a village? And even in your own writing, you sometimes say violence disrupts everything because everyone has to move. But then you're finding this differential effect of violence at the individual level, but we know everyone moved because they're all in the camp. So I think just going back through that, the paper is really in a good place to kind of add those layers that you're getting feedback on. And it's up to you. We can talk about this or we can move on to the close ties. It's your call.
Yeah, I had just kind of like one follow-up about trying to test. So I try to test in the end this mechanism of like, whether it was initial ties or trauma that's causing this lack of close ties. And that's when I disaggregate this binary measure of violence. So what I'm trying to show there, and this is a limitation of the data too, that I can't get at this that directly. I didn't measure, trauma within the survey instrument, which would have been nice to have done. But so what I'm trying to show there is that if your family experiences of violence, that should have a larger effect on your initial ties than witnessing violence, because somebody close to you is more likely to be removed from the network. That network is disrupted. But then I show that the effect within the close ties network or the high communication network is one that's driven by witnessing violence. And the idea is that that is some evidence in support of it not being a lack of initial ties that is causing the lack of close ties, but instead something else, which might be trauma because it's witnessing violence that's driving it. So that's the argument I'm trying to make there. Is this something that's like statistically convincing to you and I'm not framing it correctly, or is it misguided is I guess the question I would have.
The question I had about that was, is it the case that the family member exposure to violence, does that mean they died? Or does that just mean that they were, right? So I guess it's a question of like the distribute. What I was wondering is it necessarily the case that that variable is measuring a difference in what you're calling the pre-displacement ties, right? Like if they survive, especially if the trauma idea is still an empirical one that's to be, fleshed out, is it actually proxying for greater levels of disruption in the pre-displacement ties?
Okay.
Right. And when comparing it to the trauma mechanism, that's also part of this, right? Is which one is more traumatic, and can we even make that judgment? Do we even know how to make that judgment? But you can talk about that.
If I can come in on this really quickly, Daniel, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I actually wasn't sure why violence to one's family would necessarily automatically disrupt the pre-displacement, such as we're calling them that, the village ties in the camp. Mm-hmm. And that might be because you need to tell us a little bit more, at least in the appendix, about the nature of the survey and whether or not if I was being surveyed in the camp as the spokesperson for my household, would even think to mention people in my family as people I talk to frequently, or if that would just be obvious. And so I'm only talking to people in the rest of the village. And if my family is the one that experienced the violence, I think I just don't know that I follow your thinking on that one. Mm-hmm. So maybe you want to clarify that now so we can respond to whether it's fully convincing.
Sorry, my Wi-Fi is breaking up for a second. So yeah, the idea is that so this gets back to like the theory of why like violence affects initial ties within the camps. And the idea is that not only can it like directly remove somebody that you know, but it can also directly remove somebody who knows somebody else who would then be in your network were they to still be there. So if your family experiences this violence and they're broken up in some way, that can also affect the other ties that you have as a person too, right? So like if they're a bridging tie with somebody else and they disappear, then you lose that tie in your network, if that makes sense. And so that's like one mechanism through which the family member experiencing violence can like reduce my own personal network too.
Daniel, would you have any way in your data to determine whether or not respondents were willing to list family members as communication partners? Could you like use names or measure that directly to get it like part of Zoe's question of like, did they understand your question to exclude family or not?
Yeah, actually, I asked them if it was a family member or not. So I think I can look at that directly. Yeah. So the
that would be
idea
a
is
great,
I'd want to show that they weren't naming their family members.
and that would be a great way to test some of those second order impacts of having violence or losing family. And you want to think about it as relative loss of family, right? Because like the raw number of family members, although it kind of mathematically makes sense as a social scientist, if you're talking about the effect of violence on the cognitive and social landscape, then it's relative to what one's family used to look like, right? So that if, you know, a 12-person family is down to 8, that would matter more than, I don't know. I think that was a bad mathematical example because then it was going to be the same for the other one. The only other, sorry, one question I had was you show the probability of a new tie being a close tie, but you didn't show the probability of a village tie being a close tie. Is that like necessarily inverted?
No, I mean, so it's actually negative for both. I just didn't show both of them because I didn't think that other finding spoke to the mechanism, but would that be something you'd want to see as well there?
It begged the question for me of why you weren't showing it. So
okay, fair enough.
I thought maybe it was inconvenient data.
No, I'll add that to the appendix then, just to get that ahead of time.
Daniel, do you want to ask us to talk about a new point, or do you want to go to the close ties question, which I think came up in multiple points of your discussion. So it's a good option for sure.
Talking about close ties and like what the best framing for that is, I think is, so what I understood from these comments that probably the best thing to do would be to explicitly talk more in that section of why ties matter, about why information is like a key mechanism here. And then in the definition of close ties, note that it's capturing like the information aspect, which it may imply other things, but it's primarily capturing like the information transmission aspect. Would that be like probably a decent way to go about it?
Yeah, for me, I certainly think so. Like, I think that would basically resolve all of this. And I think you don't need to I would cast a vote that you don't need to change the term close. Close would be just fine. And it's not even, you know, you're in the spirit of grant a veteran strong ties. He even lists frequency as one of the criteria for being strong. Like it's all good. You just need to let the reader know precisely which aspect matters and then why it matters. And your plan that you just laid out would do that. So I think that'd be great.
Okay.
Can I just add one other thing? I totally agree with everything Jen said, but I also think this is a good opportunity to make a plug for incorporating trust a little bit more into your discussion of the effects of violence and trauma. So you kind of mentioned fear, but to me, like hearing about people having smaller networks, I was thinking a lot about trust and why you might not want to communicate to as many people with high frequency. And I think that enables you to kind of be a little more nuanced around the quality of relationships puzzle while still kind of sticking to your guns on the like frequency is what I mean by close, and you want diversified networks to have access to, you know, expansive information and other resources.
Yeah, and Daniel, I also thought about the literature on trust because there's a lot, well, in my view, there's been a growth in this kind of research in cases in Latin America, which have been maybe slightly more accessible than some of doing this detailed survey work in areas with conflicts that are ongoing or that are very recently ended. And it could be too much to fit in, but at the same time, the whole big sort of story about victimization and victimization effects on trust or trust in government or on each other, there is a lot of that in that literature that you might be able to help just clarify for your readers what you are talking about and what you are definitely not talking about.
Got it. So that would just be like clarifying that these networks are measuring communication, not trust, or what would be the, because I don't measure like trusted networks necessarily like directly.
I was thinking of it more not as like, it's not, you can make it clear that it's not something you're measuring per se, but I think it might be one of the like unobserved mechanisms that you could allude to as something that might be going on, because you're referring to trauma, although you haven't measured PTSD, you know, there's a lot that's not like quantified that is still something that you can kind of interpret through your own research data and through conversations with your interlocutors. So I thought it was a mechanism.
Oh, okay. So like violence leads you maybe to trust people less, which is why you'd have maybe perhaps less ties.
or would engage less frequently, and like you wouldn't forge a tie with someone that you'd be willing to go back to repeatedly because you're the kind who's hesitant to trust anyone and forging that kind of relationship with. So yeah, I think I wouldn't go, I don't think you'd want to pitch it as like a fully distinct mechanism. I think I think where this discussion is going is it is sort of like an explanation for why communication might recur and happen frequently, and then people would have those kinds of relationships afoot. But I would definitely make sure that you explain why communication is a part of that, since all you get to measure directly is the communication part of it.
Yeah, I was seeing it less as actually a mechanism, and I don't want to muddle your mechanisms, and a little bit more as just saying what you aren't. Like, you're doing communication, you're doing information. One might think of these other things. They're over here, I'm over here, kind of discussion, but you'll choose your own adventure on that.
Got it.
We probably have room for one sort of final closing comment. I know we're right at the end here, but do you have one pressing question you want to get out there before we close?
Yeah, so the last question, I think, so Jen and Mike both talked about the like dyadic regression. So I guess my question is, with the way that it currently is formed, so the reason that I use the dyadic regression right now is because I want to be able to basically account for dyadic dependence within the data, like as like a network modeling approach. And so it's almost more of like I'm trying to show that when I then move to the individual level, that same approach, having the same results, is not just due to the fact that like there's a lot of like network effects going on within the data. I mean, is this something that I should leave, or something that I could then just move to the appendix and say that I also take this approach there, and then like not need both approaches in the paper? Or, I mean, it seems like with network data, my first idea was like, you need to use like a network approach to this, but maybe it's not necessary here. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
I mean, it's possible Michael and I'll have different ideas on this. For me, I like the dyadic side of it because it answers a different question than the individual stuff. The individual stuff is sort of like by personality or by personal experience. What is a person inclined to do? The dyadic stuff acknowledges that it takes two to form a tie. And so it asks who forms ties with whom. And that's why I think like my vote would be keep the dyadic stuff, but do two dyadic regressions, one that asks the question of whether the presence of violence matters, and one that asks whether or not if both have violent experiences, that changes their propensity to forge ties with each other. And I think that would let you answer like very interesting additional things about, and you can maybe speculate about whether it's trauma that allows this or not. You can bring in a lot of your other stuff, but I think it answers different questions. So I vote keep dyad.
Awesome. I actually thought about it the same way, but the reason I raised it was because I didn't see essentially that dyadic variation, the questions underlying that and the argument that would link to the empirical implications. Maybe it's in there and I didn't quite get it, but I didn't see that discussion to then inform my thinking about how to interpret the dyadic regression results as evidence in favor of what you were arguing. So I would say, if that is something that, if those sets of questions are something that you want to enrich the paper with, well, I mean, then we're going to bump up into, word count and other limitations, but to think about providing the front end for the reader to think about how to interpret that regression in light of the arguments that are being made, and just like describe that outcome, that dyadic outcome, as distinct. And then separately on the individual regression, I don't know. I mean, the methodologists will know better, but is there a way, whether or not you do the dyadic regression, ways to account for those network dependencies in the individual regression by like something like a spatial, a spatial model, but in the network, you see what I'm saying? If that's a concern, then maybe you want to think about that in the individual regression, regardless of whether you do the dyadic.
Yeah, and if I may jump in too on this, Daniel, it's a sequencing problem, in my opinion. You should definitely do the dyadic regression for sure. Put it after the individual stuff, because all of the writing is about the individual. And then for me, as your reader, I got to the dyadic regression, was like, nice, like good idea. Let's see some dyadic covariates. That'd be cool. Like, let's get into this. But most your readers are going to get to that and think, why are we doing this? So I think if you put it second, just like the reason you just gave us, which is, don't I need to account for network effects? Yeah, and I think that's smart. And I agree with what Jen said about it. but maybe put it second and say, see, my overarching story of what's going on here holds even when I account for this stuff. And as you develop the paper, like Mike said, if there's stuff to interpret there that you want to bring out, then I think you can build that in more. But for now, I think it's mainly just a sequence problem.
Awesome.
But it's good.
Yeah, I appreciate
idea.
That.
I know
okay.
but one quick thing that you could do, I super agree with Jen on the possibility of both people experiencing violence changing our expected observation of a tie. You could bracket that for another paper and also use your directed data, because I know that you can't get to the directed data here. And so you sort of told us about it and then didn't give it to us. And so that paper might fit nicely together as a like purely dyadic paper where you can then like live out your, you know, implications, narrative, dreams.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. This has been like so helpful.
Yeah, we are glad here at the OPSC that this was helpful. I have some closing comments that I will keep really brief, which is thank you so much to Daniel for bringing this paper to the OPSC. And thank you, Jen, Mike, and Zoe for being our discussants. It's so great. And if anything, also, especially during this time, it's hard to get good commentary and good focused discussion on our work. So thank you. We value your time. You can all go ahead and spam your friends, family, colleagues, and students with your video presence by going to our website and sending them the link to this video, which will be posted by our awesome graduate student assistant, Jennifer. We'll send out that link to make your life even easier to tell people about it. And for those who go watch this video, which we have an average of about 100 people who end up watching the video later to learn from your smart brains, you can also come to our talk. Next week, we have a double feature. We have a talk at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. because scheduling is hard under COVID. So thank you everyone for your time. And Daniel, I think you'll be getting lots of great comments in your email too. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks for organizing.
Great paper,
Thanks,
Daniel.
Yeah. Great work, Daniel and Cassie. Way to run it.
Congrats, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you guys so much.